Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, this is Andy Strickler. I am currently the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College, located in New London, Connecticut. I've also worked in athletics and admissions at Kalamazoo College, Beloit College, Sinus College, and Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Friends, I had a sensational week. Now, you heard about my 26-day trip to California if you're regular listeners. Well, now I'm about to embark on a 23-day trip to North Carolina, Virginia, and 2 days in South Carolina. I leave in 3 days for Wilmington, North Carolina, where I'll tour UNC Wilmington, and then 9 days of family reunion from both my birthday and Thanksgiving. We've got an Airbnb in Corolla, North Carolina, which is the Outer Banks. It'll be my mom, my niece, my nephew, of course, Anitra, Karis, and Joy, my brother Norm from Denver, his son Alex, Kara's boyfriend, and one of Joy's great college friends from London, England, who met at UGA and is a student at LMU in Los Angeles. It's kind of tradition for us to join us for Thanksgiving every year. And after those 9 days, I'll be in Virginia from November 30th to December 12th, doing college tours. Hampton University, Christopher Newport University, William and Mary, VCU, James Madison, UVA, University of Virginia, Washington and Lee, and Virginia Tech. One a day. Be there basically from like 8:30 till 12, Monday through Friday. You know, grab some lunch, check out the surrounding area, head to the next location, check in my hotel, and work on the podcast and do Zoom meetings with families. So if you love this work, that's very, very exciting. Then on my way back, I'll spend a day in Winston-Salem and see Wake Forest again and Spartanburg Furman, a couple days there. A lot of these colleges are not new at all to me. I've been to all but one. In fact, many of them I've actually been to in the last 18 months, but I'm going to be in that area and I got students I want to visit. So I'll get to, that's how you learn about the school as well. You visit with your students and they tell you what they like and what they don't like, and it's another way to learn about the school besides just the traditional information session and tour. I'm also pumped because I had 3 interviews this week, and I really think you guys are going to like these interviews. Now, I prefer not to do interviews on the road because you can get spotty Wi-Fi. You know, you can have a loud neighbor, and there's nothing you can do about it. What are you going to do? I mean, they paid for the room just like you did. You can get bad acoustics. I mean, I've certainly done it before. You do what you have to do. But I wanted to get all these interviews done before I went on the trip. So now all interviews are completed through December 2024. Now, what are the 3 I'm referring to? Well, I interviewed Rob Franick, the editor-in-chief of all of the publications you see from Princeton Review. And we talk about what you can learn from the 168,000 surveys Princeton Review did on college campuses this year. And I get really excited anytime we're talking about ways students and parents can go beyond the marketing to see the school for what it is. So this is an interview that's going to air on our Thursdays, and it'll begin in around 5 weeks in the middle of December is when you'll see that interview. I'm also very excited to announce to you a conversation I had with Rob after the interview. And I was thinking about waiting to roll this announcement out on episode 500, but that's still too far away. So I'm going to share it with you now. So Rob agreed to donate 100 books to our listeners. So here's how it's going to work. If a listener sends in a question for a listener via SpeakPipe and we read it on the air, you're going to get your choice of one of multiple different publications that the Princeton Review has produced. And I'll let you know the choices. You'll pick the one that's most interesting to you. And Princeton Review is actually going to send the book directly to you. That's such a load off our shoulders because we were trying to do this through stamps.com. You may remember in the past we did a couple book giveaways, like 15 here, 15 there. But 100 books, that's almost a 2-year supply for us. Unless sometimes we do run 2 questions for a listener in the same episode. So it'll probably cover us for at least a year and a half. And very excited about that. We get to thank you for sending in a question. And Princeton Review gets a little publicity for being generous to us. Now, yesterday was awesome with a capital A. I did 3 hours worth of interviews, and I get really stoked when I have great interviews. But I realize interviews are also tiring because you're like concentrating a lot. After the 3 hours, I was ready for a nap. But I think you're really going to like these interviews. The first one I did was a 90-minute deep dive on Duke University with Christoph Gutentag, the admission dean in year 33 there. That interview is going to be 40 to 45 minutes on Duke and understanding Duke, and then another 40 to 45 minutes on Duke's admission practices and how they read files. That episode will air on Mondays, beginning at the start of January, but we did a real deep dive on Duke. Next, I did as deep a dive as I think you're going to hear anywhere on how early decision works with Andy Strickler. And I thought of Andy because a listener reached out with a specific question for Andy about how Conn College's ED process worked. And so I thought, Andy, you're the perfect guy to address this topic. And so I asked Andy 18 questions that I had for him about ED1 and ED2 and how they're different and everything. And, Andy was just phenomenal. He just said so many profound things that I decided to air that immediately. I mean, talking about today, you're going to hear it today, at least part 1 of 4. And I decided to do that because if you have a senior, you can take advantage of a lot of the wisdom that he imparted on us immediately. If it makes sense, or if you're considering ED1 or well, not so much ED1, that's past, but ED2 in this admissions year. So I just decided that was more time sensitive than me doing another NACAC workshop and sharing that from you. I can do that at any time. So our mission at Your College Bound Kid is to make college knowledge available to all. And I get really excited when I do an interview that I feel is a real deep dive, something I'm not hearing at this level of depth anywhere else. So I'm very excited about that. I think you're going to enjoy it immensely. You should also know Lisa did an outstanding interview, and I can't wait for you to hear this. It's with Erin Llewellyn, and she's an expert on Gen Z. And so she'll be talking about myths about Generation Z. And that interview will air in 5 weeks from today on Monday's episodes. I used to leave a conference and I'd get all these commitments from people to do interviews. And sometimes I'd come on here and tell you who committed to do interviews. And your longtime listeners will remember this. The problem with that is sometimes these things literally take years. I mean, Christoph Gutentag first committed at the College Board Conference in September, actually, 2020, I'm struggling today, 2022 in Orlando. So, I mean, do the math, 26 months ago. I think Gary Clark might have the record 4 years. But there are a few others that are around 4 years, like from the time they commit to the time it actually happens. And that's just a combination of either them being busy, me being busy, both of us being busy, or probably not always the best communication on my part, So I no longer tell you who's committed to doing interviews, but I will tell you after an interview has been completed, because those are kind of in the kitty, and you're going to hear them like within the next 10 weeks. Finally, what else made this week so great? A number of you sent very inspiring texts, emails, SpeakPipe messages about what I said at the start of episode 492. And I just want everyone to know that you really made my week. You inspired me. It's amazing what speak pipe message or a short text or a brief email can do to just put you in a fantastic state of mind. So thank you for everyone who communicated with me this week. Those messages were really appreciated. All right, I have one big announcement to make today, and then you're going to hear from Andy Strickler about early decision. And then you'll hear part 4 or 5 with David Hawkins about the NACAC survey. They did their first ever survey with 1,000 high school students examining their attitudes about college. So, friends, as you know, we're launching Counselors Connect. That's our new rollout name. It's a lot better than College Counselors Confab. Happy not to do that 7-syllable one anymore. It's our professional development and support group for college counselors. This is version 2.0. Met with my co-leader, Michelle Silbernagle from Washington this week to do some initial planning, to read the responses, because the application asks you guys a bunch of questions like when are good times to meet and what are some topics you'd like for us to discuss and a number of other things. Last I checked, 38 counselors had completed the app form, but I'm sure it's into the 40s by now. And so we have a nice group of college counselors in all 4 of our counselor categories. That would be public school college counselors, independent or private school college counselors, community-based organization or CBO college counselors, and IECs, independent educational consultants. But we're at the point now where we want to really start micro-targeting some areas where, just like in admissions, where we feel like our applicant pool is a little soft, where we could use more applicants. And I have this mic, so I have an opportunity to recruit through this, through making announcements. So if you're in any of the following areas, we really would love to have you apply. Public school college counselor, CBO college counselor, independent school college counselor, counselors from the Midwest. I think we only have 3 from the Midwest. We're very strong on the coast, but we need more from the Midwest. Counselors from international locations or who do a lot of international placement. Male counselors, counselors of color, IECs with significant counseling experience. So you're thinking, well, what's significant counseling experience? Well, I'd say if you've worked with 200 families or more, that's pretty significant college counseling experience. Or if you're in year 7 or more, it's pretty significant college counseling experience. We could use more people with that breadth of experience. We have a nice chunk because IECs are the biggest group of the 30. So far of the 38, we have around 6 public schools, 6 independent school, 5 or 6 CBO, and then 20 IECs so far. I know that math's probably not perfect and just going by recollection, but it's close to that. And counselors with college admissions experience, we could use some more people there as well. Now, after looking at all the times you guys said are available, we are strongly leaning towards Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain, 5 p.m. Pacific. Once again, it's a 1-hour meeting. So if you're on the East Coast, you're out by 9. If you're on the West Coast, you're out by 6. And that's just based on the feedback we have. Also, we did use Sunday night last time, although we started a bit later. Sunday night was what surfaced from our survey the first time. Seems to be a good time. I mean, we look at things you run into with sports and running kids around, the school things. It makes the other days a little tougher, Monday through Friday and Saturday. You can't please everyone. Sure, we'll probably lose some people because we're going to pick a time that won't work for them, and it kind of is what it is. There's no way you can get a time that works for everybody. Now, one more thing. We are launching on Sunday, January 26th. Sunday, January 26th. And I'm going to continue to communicate from this format because this group actually got birthed out of the podcast. It happened when I started showing up at some of the webinars and I'd realized half the people were college counselors. Like, oh, we have potential for a community here. And the nice thing about college counselors, too, is they don't drop off after the kid goes to college. Now, our diehard parents, they continue to listen. But some of them say, hey, I love you guys, but I'm not thinking college anymore, and we lose some. So our format, we're looking at having 30 minutes where we're all together as a group, and we can discuss hot topics. And you guys sent in unbelievable topics. We have such a long list in the application of things you're interested in talking about. And then we'll break out into smaller groups for the last 30 minutes. So what that allows us to do is we can accommodate some decent size because you can get your community in your smaller, almost like affinity group, right? So the CBO counselors can meet and the public counselors can meet. Now, for the IECs, we're looking at breaking it up between newer IECs, mid-level, and more experienced all together so everybody can learn from each other. But we can accommodate more smaller pods or whatever you want to call them with this format. And sometimes we might have a guest speaker for that first 30 minutes. I mean, not everything's etched in stone, but this is just what we're looking at starting out with. Of course, we'll be getting input from everybody. Finally, Michelle's going to add Slack channels. That's right. And we started this before, but we had such a smaller group and we're only meeting twice a year. So it never took off like it could. But Slack channels allow us to have message boards between the month. So we could have a whole Slack channel called Breaking News where we go on and post anything brand new. We find out another public schools adding early decision or whatever it is, and we post it. I'm very excited about that. That'll keep our communication going between months. Of course, we're not only going to communicate just through this bully pulpit. I will send out an email. Michelle will send out emails. We'll communicate via email as well. But our priority date is 23 days away, December 10th. Just go to yourcosmokid.com, go to the resource page, and click Counselors Connect. If you're a parent, please tell your public school or independent school counselor about this group. It's only going to make your counselor a better counselor, which will help them serve you and the kids at your school more effectively. All right, friends, let's dive in with my conversation with Andy, where I ask him 18 questions about how early decision really works. And listeners sent in 2 questions, so there's 20 altogether. And if you've heard Andy, you get as much honesty and transparency with expertise as you'll get from any admission officer, and he does not disappoint.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 1 of 4, Andy shares how early decision helps colleges. Andy tells us whether having 45 to 48% of your class coming in ED is intentional, or does it just work out that way? Andy shares why he doesn't want the incoming class to be more than 50% early decision. Andy shares the 3 main reasons why the yield for early decision is 95% and not 100%. Andy explains why he feels, and I quote him here, without a doubt, ED is going to become more popular with public universities across the country. Andy gives an example of how applying ED is not as hard to get in as applying regular decision, but he also explains how applying ED is sometimes in the financial best interest of under-resourced families. Andy answers the question, does he expect affinity scores and engagement tracking and demonstrated interest to start being done at a much higher level with the public universities than is currently being done right now? Listen and enjoy. Hey, Andy, great to have you back.
Mark, awesome to be back, man. Love being with you guys. It's
Thank
Friday
you.
afternoon too. I wish you could see me because it's Spirit Day here at Connecticut College, so I am fully decked out in all my camel gear with a hat, hoodie, sweatshirt, t-shirt, sweatpants, the whole bit.
That's Spirit Day. That's what you do on Spirit Day. It's all good.
Yep. We're hosting first and second round of the NCAA men's soccer tournament here tomorrow and Sunday. So there's a nice buzz on campus, and our president was like, we should all wear camel gear on Friday. And I was like, so dress like Andy Strickler Day. I got it.
I do that all the time.
Exactly.
Well, we're thrilled to have you back. I told you I was going to take you up on that once a quarter time and have your feedback. And we've got a great topic. Multiple listeners have sent in questions about ED1 versus ED2. You have both ED1 and ED2?
We do.
What about the past schools you've worked at? Did they have ED1 and ED2?
No. Con's the first place I've worked at that has had both. Okay. I've worked at places that had an ED1 in December, but Con, and I think it's mostly because of sort of NESCAC practice, specifically around recruited athletes, that we have ED1 and ED2.
Yeah. Well, let's start out with just, a very basic question. How does ED help colleges?
Oh, well, that's easy.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, there are 2 primary reasons that I can think of where ED is really going to help an institution. For us, speaking purely from a selfish perspective,
Yeah.
it gives us the ability to lock in anywhere from, on our end, it's 42 to 48%, but there's schools that are 50, 55, 60, 65% of their class via early decision. And what that does is it insulates your yield by filling such a significant portion of your class with students who have already said, you're my first choice. If I get admitted, I'm definitely coming. So you can take advantage of a 95% yield rate on 65 to 70% of your class.
Yeah.
It helps you drive your selectivity down and drive your yield up. So that's one reason. There's some admission reasons why ED makes a lot of sense. And again, we've talked about athletics a million times.
Yeah.
I am really close with our athletic programs here, as I just insinuated via
Yeah.
the soccer championship tomorrow. But the other way that it really helps colleges and universities is in the realm of athletic recruitment, specifically when it comes to roster management and, more importantly, retention. And retention, we tend to think about retention being an institution specific issue, but really retention is a student centered and family centered sort of perspective, because high retention means happy kids.
Sure.
And what do we want in this process if we're an adult? Well, we want our kids to be happy. So the use of early decision specifically by athletic programs allows for effective roster management, which allows for more transparent conversations on the front end, fewer surprises on the back end in terms of how many people are being recruited to play my position. And it helps create happy kids and greater levels of retention. We've done some retention analysis here at Con, and actually our recruited athletes retain at a higher rate than the rest of our student body. And part of that is the transparency that we can have with student athletes on the front end, and the use of early decision to make sure we don't end up with too many players at any particular position.
So, Andy, you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, but something like 45 to 48% of the class is coming in ED. Is that an intentional goal that you set and you say, this is how many we're going to have come in through ED, because we know we're going to see some strong kids in regular, and we want to leave, in your case, the majority of the spots for regular? Or is it just kind of, that's about where it ends up being? There's not really an intentional number. It's more like you take the kids that you feel meet the standards, and it just kind of ends up working to be around 45 to 48.
It's a little of both. Philosophically, I'm a little old school
Mm-hmm.
in that I'm not a big fan of going north of 50% in the class via early decision, simply because I think the expectation that a 17-year-old student will be in a position, an emotional or maturity position, to make a choice about a first choice college by the time they get to November 15th of their senior year. I think at times that's an unreasonable expectation to make of students. I also think that for a student who comes from a low income or first generation background, the ability to visit, explore financial aid, parameters, and possibilities, and figure out a first choice college by November 1st or November 15th is even more challenging. And then what I would say on top of that is we do have some need to hold some spaces for regular decision where we get some absolutely fantastic candidates. And if we go too big on ED on the front end, we end up not having the ability to admit some really, really great, fantastic, wonderful kids on the back end. So for us, it's a byproduct of kind of a philosophical perspective that we don't necessarily want to exceed 50% with some applicant volume restrictions on the front end, because we're not Harvard, we're not Yale. We don't end up with ED pools that are so large that we could fill the entire class and not make any compromises whatsoever when it comes to early decision admits, when it comes to the profile of the entire class.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the reasons why public schools are against ED, right? Virginia Tech recently reversed having an ED policy, saying, I think kids should be able to compare financial aid offers. Some of the other public schools come out and say, what you said, I just don't necessarily think a kid has maturity to know in October
Yeah,
what they'll know in May. But then there's those institutional needs that you have to still meet your enrollment goals.
right.
Yeah.
And operate within, the universe of how the public judges higher ed institutions. As much as we don't want to, we don't want to talk about it, but
Yeah.
people care about admit rates and people care about yield rates. And I'd like to go to a place that's super duper duper selective. Well, how do you become super duper selective? You try to make one admit for one enrolled student. Ideally, if I wanted to drive the admit rate as low as possible and I wanted a class of 520 students, I would try to do that on 520 admits, which means our admit rate is as low as possible.
Yeah.
And the public cares about that. And we can't, ignore that. And sometimes telling the public what they should and should not care about kind of backfires on you.
Yeah. No, this is why I love having you on. Like, so once again, this is an example of a transparent conversation. If anyone's not following, it's just the public cares about admit rates. You're going to have a lower admit rate the more people you take ED because you're gobbling up spots, and then the masses come in for less spots, drives your admit rate down, and then people think you're a better school. And you
Right.
can ignore that, and you ignore it at your peril. It'll be harder for you to yield kids. It'll be harder for you to attract the kinds of kids that you want to attract. I experienced this in admissions more than 20 years ago. It hasn't changed. It's only gotten worse.
Yeah, it's totally gotten worse.
So you said something that was interesting. You'll get 95%. So there's a little bit of slippage, right? It's not 100%.
Correct.
And I've heard the slippage is different things, right? In some cases, it's the slippage is people didn't get the financial aid award they thought, and then they say, "Hey, I didn't know you can ask me to pay this," and then you're not going to throw someone in jail. It's more of an understanding and agreement, so people let them out over that. And the other reason I've heard the slippage has to do with some people push to a gap year. Then if it's a gap year, you're not actually counted in that
Correct.
year's class. Would those be the two big reasons why the 95 is not 100?
Yeah, I would actually add a third.
Yeah, go ahead.
So financial aid is one. And
Yeah,
we try to have as many of those conversations as we can on the front end so we
yeah,
can have a person when they apply ED, they already know kind of what the financial parameters are. Second, and this is probably the largest for us in terms of ED melt, are gap years and deferrals.
sure.
And the third one is life circumstance changed. For instance, an ED kid from the West Coast who applies ED and is really fired up about con, and then younger sibling gets sick or parents get a divorce or grandmother is diagnosed with cancer, and all of a sudden I'm feeling a need to stay closer to home.
Yeah,
We will get a fair number of those as well, where they just say, boy, I'm telling you, going to college all the way across the country, which sounded great last October, the circumstances in my life have changed enough where I don't think that's the best plan for me anymore.
no, no. Well said. Well said. Absolutely, those are going to happen. I remember having those happen on my side. Things don't change. Some stuff changes and some stays the same, Andy.
Yep, exactly.
So let's talk about recently Vermont and Yukon, two schools you're familiar with, flagship
Yep,
not too far from you,
yep,
added ED, something that was considered a little bold, right? I mean, I remember when UVA added ED, it was a front page in the Washington Post at that time. This is 2019.
right,
They were the only flagship public
right.
to have ED. Do you think this is a trend? Do you think 5 to 10 years from now you're going to see more ED with publics?
Oh, absolutely, without
Yeah,
a doubt.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And explain to our listeners why. I feel the same way. Explain why.
I think there's just too much incentive to, and I would include the word pressure
Yeah,
in addition to the word incentive to focus on institutional needs and institutional priorities
sure.
that, early decision, many times works as a benefit to the institution when it comes to metrics that the public cares about. I think that pressure is real. And I think that the benefit to the institution is important enough. But at the same time, it gives the student with a slightly marginal profile who would be at risk in a regular decision pool, especially a selective regular decision pool at a place like UVA or Michigan, a place like UConn, where you have some level of selectivity, and you take a student who would be, in the big meaty part of the bell curve. And if they're super duper interested, it gives them one tool that they can use to boost their chances of admission to a place that they are really, really interested in. So I think you could make an argument that it serves institutional purposes, but for a specific group of students, it also serves those students in some really meaningful ways. And therefore, you could make an institutional specific argument, but also a student-centered argument as to why early decision would be a good thing for a public institution to adopt.
Yeah, and I absolutely know what you're talking about, and that could be a couple different demographics. It certainly could be, families of means who do not need to compare money,
Right,
and for whom going to quote unquote the right school is important enough that if I'm leaving 20 or 30, 40,000 on the table, it is what it is,
right,
At schools that can get very generous with their packages, it can also serve the other side of the financial barbell.
absolutely.
Like, this is my best chance to get into this school that meets full demonstrated need, maybe without loans or whatever, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pay more if I don't get into one of those kinds of generous schools, and ED gives me the best opportunity to do that.
And there are two seniors who are currently floating around this campus
Mm-hmm.
who I know extraordinarily well, both of them. And during the process, they applied to Connecticut College and they were regular decision applicants. And they both approached me and said, should I consider moving to ED2? And, being in my position,
Sure.
which is I see all the data. I know what a strong profile is. I know what a marginal profile is. I advised both of them. And I said, if you end up in ED, your chances of admission are really, really good. In regular decision, you are in a vulnerable part of our applicant pool.
Yeah.
And both chose because they're both students who come from socioeconomically challenged environments and therefore need significant financial aid. Both of them chose to go ED. And, I still see, but I just saw one of them. Oh boy. I think I saw one of them yesterday when I was driving off, no, Wednesday when I was driving off campus, and one actually works in my office. So I see the second one all the time.
I love it. Concrete examples. Love it.
Does it work in the institution's best interest to get 2 additional students? Sure. But really what was most important there is putting both of those students in a position where they could secure an offer of admission, but more importantly, secure an offer of admission that accompanied a significant guarantee to meet full demonstrated need financial aid award,
Yeah.
of which neither of them had at that point in time.
That's awesome. I wasn't surprised one iota when you responded so confidently, look to see more ED in Publix over the next few years, for a few reasons. One is, I know we've talked on the podcast a lot about the confluence of factors putting pressure on colleges, right? Like rolling
Right.
cliff, birth dearth, the war on college out there,
Yep.
alternative pathways, whether it's just, anything from online to badges to credentials to just coming right out and working and getting this, that, the other. And then FAFSA fiasco. And then who knows what's going to go on now with tax on the Department of Education and all this stuff. I mean, there's just a lot coming at colleges that's putting more pressure on conversion.
Right.
And taking the people in the admissions funnel and getting them to be matriculants.
Correct.
And so I've had 2 interviews I've done in the last 4 or 5 months on the public side One was with Fabrizio Delosio, AVP at Tennessee, and one was with the former VP of Enrollment at Indiana. His name is Don Hostler, and he is one of the main contributors to the book, edited by Stephen Bird, Lifting the Veil on Enrollment Management, How a Powerful Industry is Limiting Social Mobility in American Higher Education. And I interviewed Stephen and Don on the podcast about 3 months ago. And they both talked about what they anticipate will be the growth of the public's moving toward like affinity scores and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
engagement tracking, because you
sure.
know that's mostly done in the private realm right now.
Yes, it is.
But that's another thing. Don't you think it's inevitable that that's coming to the publics in greater volume than we see now?
Oh, absolutely. But I would also say that this is not something that is restricted or only impacting admission in higher ed. You know, the use and the understanding of analytics and data is influencing all elements of our society. Think
Sure.
about how the NBA has changed in the last 15 or 20 years, and baseball has changed, and political campaigns have changed with the use of big data and analytics
Right.
and high propensity vote, you know, all this stuff. And
Yeah, you're right.
therefore, you know, and the common topic that you hear all the time is artificial intelligence, and we be dumb to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that artificial intelligence, our AI, is not going to impact higher ed. So data and predictive modeling, which influences our everyday world,
Mm-hmm.
assuming it's not going to impact selection criteria in a public environment in higher education, I think is burying your head in the sand. Of course it is. You know, more and more institutions are going to start thinking about this stuff in data-oriented ways.
Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Andy Strickler, where he answers 20 frequently asked questions about early decision. Hope you'll join us next week for the next segment.
And now, this week's interview with a special guest.
Okay, friends, in part 4 or 5, David shares some more results from students about what the students overvalued and undervalued when it comes to their perceptions of college admissions. David and I do some editorializing about some of the reasons why the perception of the admission factors that student thinks matters is so different from what the survey research shows that college show they really value. David and I talk about how confusing holistic admissions is to students, and we postulate one reason why college admissions is so confusing. Then David talks about how students are experiencing high anxiety. Listen and enjoy.
And so if the process is reductive, and some of our work recently has suggested that maybe it is too reductive in some important ways, that we're missing a lot of students, I could see where students would reflect that back to us and say, well, look, if all you care about is X, Y, and Z, yet here I am, this unique, one of a kind, budding young intellect, then I'm sure you could feel like, geez, I'm just one of the cattle sort of being moved through the fence on this thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things there. Like one is kind of what you're saying. Like if you think all that matters is grades and scores, then it could make you feel like a number. If you feel like, as one of our listeners shared with me recently, his daughter got over 9,700 emails. So like just the torrent of information coming at you
Mm-hmm.
may make it feel that way. Another thing I'll oftentimes hear from people is, oh, this whole process is just totally arbitrary. It's just a total crapshoot, not realizing there's tremendous intentionality that goes on at schools with holistic admissions. Now, of course, they're admitting according to their institutional priorities, which may make it feel really random. I get it.
Right.
But that's another thing that, so I'm just thinking out loud of like some of the reasons why it may feel that way. And then maybe also in some cases, of course, people may be applying to schools where there's not that much being collected in some instances, right? And some
That's right.
people may be
That's
like
right.
gee, it would have been nice to have an interview, or it might have been nice to have this or that and the other, and none of that stuff happened. So I don't know. I'm just going through my mind all the different reasons why they might feel that way. I'm super curious on the admissions factors. What else did you find they commented on that was either spot on with the admission professionals, like grades was number one, or was way off, like testing is number two?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the way that they believe that the factors stack up now, they did tend to slightly overvalue things like extracurriculars, the essay,
Hmm.
um, the interview to some degree. They tended to undervalue the recommendations and demonstrated interest. Now, when you shift to the question of what things should be most important, it's really interesting because about three-quarters of students said everything should be important. So, and there wasn't a lot of differentiation between the factors in that sense. But as you look at it now, it does. I mean, as you look at the system now and the students' beliefs about it, it does seem that again these tip factors we discussed this last time, the factors that aren't your grades, they aren't test scores, but that traditionally have been associated with a selective admissions process
Hmm.
seem to be a little bit overemphasized in the students' view, which I mean, this is I'm making tenuous leaps here. This is all just kind of us speculating, but it does suggest that perhaps this highly selective model is sort of still a prevalent model among a lot of students, and that tends to shape what they believe is actually important in the process for a lot of colleges.
So everything you said is so completely consistent with what I see.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a constant challenge as a counselor. I'll give you an example. So like I started a company in 2010. Last year was the first year we ever had an essay only package. And we never wanted to have an essay only package because most of the time people need help with list building. Vince Garcia, who's one of our co-hosts, he's been doing this a long time. He doesn't have an essay only package. It's like people need help with their list. Well, we finally did it because so many people were coming to us and that's all that they wanted. Like, no, I got the list. I got the list down. I just need help with the essays. So we said, well, okay, let's see if we can meet them where they're at. And occasionally we can get into it with the process and let people know you kind of need some help with the list. So we decided rather let's get a seat at the table and help them. But we see that all the time. All the time. It's not everyone. There are some who can build college lists well without missing schools that should be on their college list, but it's just quite rare. People, and here's how I like to put it. Most students and parents can identify some schools that absolutely should be on the list. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But they almost always miss other schools that should be on the list. And I'm particularly talking about a type of student here that's looking at open to a pretty big geographic search. This is not the person that, hey, I'm going to stay at home and look at, schools locally in the area. That student probably will be fine. But a lot of people are open to national search or half the country. And then the other thing that students miss is they miss, and it's not their fault. It's just really hard to do. They don't have access to data. They overestimate their chances at different schools. So that's another reason why they need help with the list. But they don't feel that they do. They feel like I need help with the essays. As long as I have good essays, and then also with extracurriculars, like it happens all the time, I'm thinking of a conversation, recently from a mom about athletics, and students just feel like, well, they've got to know, the school has to know that, my student is now the captain of the team, like as if that's the total game changer.
Right, right.
And I'll get it. I'll get the question that'll come up all the time. It'll be like, my student doesn't want to play their sport senior year, but they can't quit. They're not going to get in if they quit because they'll be seen as a quitter. And I'm not talking about anybody that's going to play like for the college at all, right? And any college would say, look, if you're hating your sport, don't do it just because you think we want you to do it. But the perception is like this extracurriculars is this huge, huge thing. And so it might have something to do with people feel like they have some agency in those areas too. Like they feel like, with the essay and the extracurriculars, this is where I can chart out and control my own destiny.
Right, right. That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's my sense.
Yeah, there are things about that, and that connects to what we were talking about in terms of students feeling just like a number.
Sure.
It would make sense that, hey, my essay should count for something. I worked really hard on it. My interview should count for something. You get to see me as a whole person in that interview process. So there is. I don't doubt that there would be that would factor into a student's thinking as well.
And I also understand why they would check a lot of boxes because when you're looking at all those options and
Yeah.
you're a student and you're seeing state test scores, I kind of don't really know what that is, but it sort of sounds important. Interview, that kind of sounds important. Portfolio, audition, that kind of sounds important. I could see how they would be like, all these things kind of sound important.
Right.
I could understand why they would do that as a student.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I'm looking at some of the other questions that we asked the students, and one of the questions was how important are various attributes to where you apply.
Hey Dave, can I pause you on that? I just want to
Oh
make
yeah.
one more comment on that other thing
Yeah.
before.
Oh sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So another area where where I'll see the extracurricular, David, is families will freak out if their kid doesn't have something that they think you need to check the box. Like one of the most common ones is they don't have 100 hours of service or something like that. What
Right.
can they start right now? And they don't realize like there's not even a requirement that you have official service, right? There may be some specific schools that it's a massive institutional priority and it'd be a plus factor, but I'm always telling them, listen, colleges want all kinds of kids. They want the kid that they do want you to be involved, right? They don't want you just eating Doritos, watching Netflix all day. But somebody's one kid is into social justice, another kid is into athletics, another kid is into the arts, another kid is into student government, another kid is into research. Somebody else spends a lot of time working, you know, and all of these different things, they're all valuable. They're all because colleges want different types of kids. That really doesn't compute with people. They think you hear this a lot, like they don't have any service, they're screwed, and sometimes you'll hear they didn't play a sport, they're in trouble. And so it's the perception that you have to have these certain extracurriculars or you're dead on arrival. So what your survey's picking up is just what I experience in the counseling room.
Well, that's good. That's affirming.
Yeah.
And I think that as I look at as I hear what you're saying, I also would add that part of
Hmm.
the reason that our organization here at NACAC that we're looking at how do we do things differently in college admission is
Hmm.
because a lot of times we have seen where there maybe a college will say to a student, and a college doesn't speak, people speak. So perhaps an admissions rep will say, well, it didn't look like this student took full advantage of their time when they were in high school, or some sort of suggestion that maybe connects to a lack of activity, or I don't know what. I think on the student side, one of the things that could be a legitimate criticism of higher ed is that institutions don't also spend a lot of time asking why a student might have a different profile, and it is that's where I think the communication with the institution, which not everybody knows they can do, not everybody has the time or the skills to do that. I have one student that I knew who grew up had autism, and in many ways totally high functioning, went to school, did the classes, did all that, but it was all he could do to just decompress during the entire afternoon and evening from the intense social experience of an 8-hour public high school, 2,000
Sure.
students kind of day. So there's higher ed has work to do as well, and I think when the students talk about feeling like a number, that's one way in which they can come out on the short end of that process. So
I also think admission officers can do a better job. And I'm going to quote Karen Kristoff, 37-year veteran. I know you may know Karen. She's at Colorado College currently and comes on our podcast a few times a year. But one of the things she said the first time she came on, and I've thought about this a lot, she said, we have to do a better job of explaining holistic admissions because sometimes the way we explain it, it comes off like everything's equal.
Right.
and it makes a kid feel like, you know, oh, it doesn't matter that my grades or my rigor's not that great. Boy, can I write my butt off, or wait till you see my recommendations, or wait till you see that I'm a captain of 2 sports and got MVP. And so, obviously there are a lot of people articulating it very well, but I do think there's room for improvement on how holistic admissions is explained. It can give kids a false lifeline. And one of the hard conversations I frequently have, I had it a couple of days ago with a student very interested in MIT, and doesn't have the academic profile that that I've never seen a kid with that profile kid in MIT. And I'm one of these people that feels like I owe it to you to share that information. And obviously that's not a fun conversation for me to have, but you know, here we are just before November 1, and they're putting all this effort into. I don't know. I'm not sure if you know this, Dave. You probably do, but MIT literally has their own application, so it's
Yeah.
not Common App, right? So
Right.
they're putting all this time into this other app, for a profile that's like not even remotely close to what MIT talks about. And that's the hard thing as a counselor. Like, how can you have these kind of conversations with people without completely deflating them? Um, but I think sometimes it's because schools don't articulate it that clearly. Now, in fairness, I've interviewed MIT on our podcast, and they I feel like they actually do a very good job of. I mean, like they just come right out and say, if you're not high 700s math, our research shows you're going to struggle on your testing, and they're very explicit about stuff like that. So
Mm-hmm.
they,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. This is not a specific knock on MIT. If anything, I've sort of appreciated how sometimes when I interview people on the podcast, they're very PC, and then others are not guarded and they just kind of put it out there. Um, but I do think there's room for taking this, what feels like a completely ambiguous, nebulous concept. The perception a lot of times with holistic admission, and I'm a huge fan of holistic admissions, right? Whole person admissions, I really believe in it to my core. But there's kind of a perception out there of, oh, that's just your way of keeping us from knowing how you really make decisions so that you can exercise your own, I'm saying intentionally sort of pejorative terms, but your own version of discrimination and picking the people you want to pick and not really tell us how you do it.
Yep.
There's really a widespread perception of that.
Oh, listen, another question on this survey asked students that very question. 74% agreed that there's a lot of bias involved in college admission decisions, and 72% say that clearly advantages the wealthy and privileged, so that might be slightly a different issue, but to your point, you're absolutely right. Admissions is very difficult to explain to most people, especially if you have a holistic selective process. Perhaps in a state system where everybody with a 2.5 or above gets in, that's pretty easy to explain, right? But unfortunately, this smaller group of institutions tends to drive what most people think of
I
as
know.
admissions.
Hmm.
An interesting sort of project that we worked on a few years back. I'm sure you'll recall the Varsity Blues scandal
Yeah.
back in the day, and I'm fond of saying that wasn't. We shouldn't call that an admission scandal. It was a bribery scandal to try to get around the admissions office. In fact, but
Yeah, that's
that's
true. Because
just.
using admissions sort of as another,
I mean,
another taking a hammer to admissions and hurts
right.
admissions. Yeah, I get it.
Right. It actually wasn't the admissions office that was the
Yeah.
problem here, but no. But right around that time, we were working in conjunction with some of our partners here in Washington D.C. that represent higher education, and we did two different focus groups. We did one with left leaning people, adults, and then another with right leaning adults. And both of them at the start had sort of equidistant, sort of distrustful attitudes towards higher education. The one on the left saying, yes, it's the bastion of the wealthy and privileged. On the right, yeah, this is higher ed is the bastion of leftists and whatever.
Liberal indoctrination. Yeah.
Right. But so both sides felt like, listen, we don't think higher ed is doing very well. But then we walked each group through a mock admissions process.
Hmm.
We had students with differing profiles. There was no single ruler by which you measured them against each other or against anything else. And after we walked them through that process, both sides moved substantially to what I'm calling the center for the moment,
Sure.
where they said, wow, that's a really tough job. And it's really hard to make decisions between students who present varying but similar profiles.
That's why a lot of colleges do case studies, right? That's a very common
Yeah,
thing for the colleges do case studies, either with for counselors or some groups put them on for the senior class and take them through exercises to help them to understand, like in a obviously you can't sort of completely simulate somebody that does this 12 months of the year, but
right.
simulate a little bit about what reading is like and all of the balls you're juggling and factors that come into play, and sit in this seat for a while and see if it helps illuminate the process a little bit.
Yeah, and I think the drawing lessons from that and from all of the conversations we've had with our members over the years, the closest I've come to sort of a unifying explanation is just that all colleges make some type of determination about whether students can academically succeed at the institution, right? So
Correct.
that tends to be sort of the floor of
Yep.
admissions decisions, right? And then after that, particularly for selective institutions and really at any degree of selectivity, they are then turning inwards to say, what do we need to make our institution run? Like,
Correct.
how many football players do we need? How many chemistry students do we need? You could have a 3.0 GPA, but be the world's greatest saxophone player.
Yeah.
There's so many ways in which institutions are having to pick. So after once that admissibility determination has been made, then it comes down to an issue of choice. And unfortunately, for colleges and universities, ultimately that doesn't boil down to super easy explanations. And where people tend to be looking for strictly sort of merit-based decisions to be made, you get decisions that are highly subjective and based on things that have nothing to do with any absolute form of merit.
I completely agree. I completely
Yeah.
agree with that. Our listeners have heard this. I oftentimes like to use the example of you got to get through the security gate before you get on the plane. But getting through the security gate doesn't get you on the plane. And the security gate are all these academic factors. And then one thing I find that does help people a little bit for that second part, if I'm talking to adults, I'll use the employer angle. You have a bakery, you know, and you have you've got two great bakers back there already, but you just lost your accountant and you lost your janitor, and now someone applies and they're another great baker. Well, you kind of have a baker, but and sometimes if I'm working with students, I'll say like pretend you're captain of a sports team. I'll find out what sport they like. Say you're basketball, and I'll say, okay, you got a center, and you've got a couple power forwards, but your point guard blew out his knee with an ACL, and you have to pick up some players. So is someone going to come, and sometimes I find talking in analogies really kind of resonates, right? You've heard the one about making the music and and what makes the best music in the orchestra. Well, if you need a harpist and a bassoonist, you have seven amazing violinists. I find sometimes that's the most helpful way I've found to help people to kind of understand, because the thing is, we're just so trained that everything is an individual meritocracy, and
Hmm.
we're just immediately programmed to go there, right? And
Yeah.
as opposed to thinking of like what what makes the best team, what makes the best orchestra, what makes the best company. It's addressing the people that I don't have. It's constantly a challenge though, but I think
Yeah.
it's great that you're producing data out here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the other key findings that I thought was really interesting, and it and it
Hmm.
it sort of ties to this sort of rigidity of perception about how this thing works, and that is that about 73%, so almost three quarters of the students we surveyed said that they worried that a small mistake on their application could affect their chances of being accepted. And it's there's a question. I'd almost turn the tables and pose a question to you because you work
Yeah,
directly with students,
sure.
which is that for me a small sort of mistake, I think at least from what I hear from admissions officers, is easily enough rectified. But there's clearly this is a process where students are very stressed out. And, we are constantly trying to think, how do we make this less of a stressful thing? Because again, what you've done over your entire K-12 schooling is so important, and then where you go next is you're going to do equally well. It's just this area of high anxiety.
Friends, this concludes this segment of my interview with David Hawkins. We hope you join us next week for the next segment. On Thursday's episode, Julie and I will discuss an article that appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education on November 8th by Eric Hoover, entitled FAFSA Fiasco Changed the Composition of the First-Year Class at Most Private Colleges. You're not going to want to miss that one. Our question from a listener comes from a student, and she wants to know about how she can find colleges with great indoor rock climbing options. And Hurley will join me for that. Our interview is part 205 with Gloria and Terry Crawford, helping us to understand glimpse videos and how they're being used in college admission offices. And our spotlight will be Fabrizio Delosio, the AVP of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And we continue to explore, how did UTK go from 17,000 apps to a couple under 60,000 in 7 years? And friends, you should know those full interviews have been up at yourcollegeboundkid.com under the interviews tab now since last Wednesday, if you want to hear them in their entirety. And we'll get the full Andy Strickler interview up this week on Early Decision as well. Friends, remember, college is not a trophy. College is not a prize. College is not the bumper sticker on your car. College is not the sweatshirt that you wear. College is about finding your best fit, finding your best match, so you can soar and reach your full potential. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.